Have you ever felt like school history books only tell one side of the story? What if some of the most important events, inventions, and cultures were left out on purpose? In this video, we'll uncover the secrets of history they never wanted you to know, and reveal the shocking truths behind what they don't teach you. History shapes the way we see the world, but what if the version we've been taught isn't the whole truth? From lost civilizations to suppressed knowledge, much of our past remains hidden in shadows. Today, we'll peel back the curtain and explore the untold chapters of human history, the parts they don't teach you in school. When we think about history, most of us go back to the same stories we learned in school. The great empires of Rome and Greece, the rise of European powers, the American Revolution, the World Wars. These dominate our textbooks and classrooms. But the truth is, these are just fragments of the larger story of humanity. What gets left out, or brushed aside, are some of the most fascinating, game-changing events and cultures that shaped the world we live in today. These forgotten truths aren't just trivia, they're evidence that history is far richer, more diverse, and more complex than what we've been told. And it raises a powerful question: why are these stories missing in the first place? Take for example the empires of Africa before colonialism. Most textbooks skim over them, leaving us with an image of the continent as primitive or undeveloped until outsiders came along. But if you look deeper, you'll find kingdoms like Mali, Songhai, and Great Zimbabwe places of immense wealth, knowledge, and influence. In the 14th century, Mansa Musa of Mali was so wealthy that when he traveled on pilgrimage, he disrupted the economies of entire regions simply by distributing gold. His empire thrived on trade, education, and culture, with the legendary city of Timbuktu becoming a center of learning that rivaled anything Europe had at the time. Yet, for generations, that story barely made it into classrooms. Instead, history was framed in a way that glorified Europe's role, while minimizing Africa's contributions to world civilization. And it doesn't stop there. Consider the civilizations of the Americas before Columbus. We're often told that Native Americans lived in scattered tribes, simple societies with little advancement, but in reality, there were great cities, intricate road networks, agricultural innovations, and powerful empires that rivaled any in Europe or Asia. The Maya developed complex calendars and mathematical systems. The Aztecs built Tenochtitlan, a city that stunned Spanish conquerors with its scale and sophistication, complete with canals, marketplaces, and advanced architecture. The Inca carved out an empire across the Andes, building roads and bridges that still amaze engineers today. Yet, when we open most history books, these civilizations are condensed into a few paragraphs, quickly overshadowed by the story of European conquest. The narrative shifts from indigenous achievements to colonial victories, erasing centuries of knowledge and progress. Then there's the forgotten truth about contributions from the East. In the West, we're often told that modern science, philosophy, and technology sprang primarily from Europe's Renaissance and Enlightenment. But long before that, the Islamic Golden Age saw scholars translating, preserving, and expanding upon knowledge from Greece, Persia, India, and China. They developed algebra, advanced medicine, and astronomical charts that shaped the world's understanding for centuries. Paper, printing, and the compass innovations that transformed human history originated in China. Yet somehow the narrative tends to downplay their influence in favor of a Eurocentric storyline. This is not just a mistake of omission. It's a reshaping of reality to highlight certain regions and diminish others. Even within Europe, there are forgotten truths that shift our understanding of history. Think about the women whose achievements were erased or attributed to men. From female inventors and scientists to rulers who commanded empires, countless stories were deliberately hidden or overlooked. Hypatia of Alexandria, a brilliant mathematician and philosopher, contributed to science during the decline of the Roman Empire, but her story is barely mentioned compared to her male contemporaries. Or consider the women of the Industrial Revolution, who played central roles in factories and innovations, yet are often left unnamed in the narrative of progress. The selective storytelling of history is not just about which civilizations are highlighted, but also about whose voices within those civilizations are heard and whose are silenced. Why do these forgotten truths matter? Because history is not just about the past, it shapes how we see ourselves today. If entire cultures, empires, and individuals are excluded from the mainstream story, then generations grow up believing that only certain parts of the world created knowledge, power, and progress. That belief feeds into modern biases, stereotypes, and inequalities. By hiding these truths, history becomes a tool not just of learning, but of control, guiding how people view their place in the world. And when you realize that, you start to see why uncovering forgotten truths is not just fascinating, but necessary. The stories of lost civilizations, suppressed cultures, and erased individuals remind us that history is not a fixed recorded, it is a narrative. And like any narrative, it reflects the perspective of the storyteller. The more we dig, the more we find that the world was never as simple or one-sided as the textbooks made it seem. Every culture, every corner of the world, contributed to the grand story of humanity in ways we are only beginning to rediscover. When we look at history, it's easy to assume that what is written in textbooks is an objective account of the past, as if historians simply reported events exactly as they happened. But the truth is, history is never neutral. It's shaped, filtered, and often manipulated by those who record it. And one of the most powerful forces behind what we know about the past is bias and censorship. The phrase history is written by the victors isn't just a catchy segment. A reality that has shaped our understanding of human civilization for centuries. Think about wars and conquests. When one side emerges victorious, their version of events dominates, while the voices of the defeated are silenced. Take the Roman Empire as an example. Much of what we know about ancient enemies, like the Carthaginians, comes from Roman sources. Carthage, once a great and powerful city-state, left behind very few records because Rome destroyed their libraries, burned their cities, and erased their story. So what remains is a biased version, Romans portraying Carthage as barbaric, cruel, and inferior. But imagine if we had Carthage's own writings, how different would our perception of them be? What innovations, philosophies, or cultural achievements might have been lost forever simply because one side had the power to erase the other's voice? This pattern repeats itself across continents and centuries. Colonization, for instance, didn't just take land, it reshaped history. When European powers spread across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they imposed their narratives, often dismissing local histories as myths or primitive legends. Entire oral traditions, passed down for generations, were ignored or destroyed because they didn't fit into the framework colonizers wanted to present. The result is that today, many people don't realize the depth of knowledge these cultures held, knowledge about medicine, astronomy, agriculture, and governance, because it was dismissed as irrelevant or erased altogether. And bias isn't only about erasing cultures, it's also about elevating certain figures while downplaying or omitting others. Look at the way explorers are remembered. Christopher Columbus, for centuries, was celebrated as the man who discovered America, but this version ignores the reality that indigenous people had been living on the continent for thousands of years, with thriving societies and rich cultures. The narrative glorified Columbus's voyage while minimizing the devastation that followed the enslavement, the disease, the destruction of entire civilizations. That isn't just omission, it's deliberate framing to support a particular vision of history, one that made colonization seem like progress instead of invasion. Censorship also plays a role in keeping inconvenient truths out of mainstream history. During times of political upheaval, ruling powers often control what can and cannot be said about the past. In totalitarian regimes, history books are rewritten to glorify leaders and erase opponents. Even in more open societies, textbooks are influenced by politics, national pride, and cultural agendas. In some countries, certain historical events are minimized or completely excluded because they are seen as shameful, divisive, or damaging to the national image. Students grow up with a version of history that has been sanitized, edited, and polished to serve a narrative of unity or pride. But bias doesn't only come from governments, it can also come from historians themselves. Every historian brings their own perspective, shaped by their culture, education, and personal beliefs. For centuries, much of recorded history was written by wealthy men from dominant societies. That means perspectives of women, minorities, and marginalized groups were often left out entirely. When we read about ancient battles, royal dynasties, and great inventions, we re-seeing a very selective lens that highlights kings and conquerors, but rarely the lives of ordinary people who made up the majority of society. The daily struggles, the cultural achievements, the voices of the powerless, these were not considered worthy of preservation, leaving us with an incomplete and biased record of the past. One striking example of this is the way indigenous histories are treated. Many indigenous cultures relied on oral storytelling rather than written records. When outsiders encountered these traditions, they often dismissed them as unreliable or primitive. But oral histories contain layers of meaning, knowledge, and truth, passed carefully across generations. They preserve memory in a way that books sometimes cannot, yet they were sidelined simply because they didn't look like the written accounts valued by colonizers. That is bias at its core, dismissing one form of truth because it doesn't fit into another culture's framework. And then there's the bias of omission when it comes to innovation. How often do we hear that certain scientific breakthroughs or inventions originated in Europe, when in fact they were developed centuries earlier in Asia, the Middle East, or Africa? Gunpowder, printing, the compass, algebra, surgical techniques, all of these were pioneered outside Europe. Yet the narrative often credits Europe for perfecting or popularizing them. This isn't just oversight, it's a reflection of whose contributions were valued and whose were ignored. By highlighting one region's role while silencing another's, history reinforces a worldview that puts certain cultures at the center of progress and others on the margins. Bias and censorship in history don't just distort the past, they shape the present. They influence how nations see themselves, how groups view one another, and even how individuals understand their own identity. When certain voices are silenced and others amplified, we grow up with a distorted picture of what humanity has achieved and who we are as a species. This isn't just about old textbooks gathering dusted about the way collective memory is built and maintained, often to serve those in power. If forgotten truths and biased narratives have shaped the way history has been handed down to us, then the natural next step is to shine a light on what was hidden, to reveal the untold. Because the power of history doesn't just lie in what is remembered, it lies in what is uncovered. The untold stories of humanity are like missing pieces of a puzzle, and once we start to fit them back in, the image of our past becomes clearer, richer, and more inspiring than anything we thought we knew. When we reveal the untold, we are not just filling gaps, we are rewriting the story from the ground up. Take the story of the Indus Valley civilization. For years, Western history books focused on Mesopotamia and Egypt as the cradles of civilization, but archaeological discoveries in present-day Pakistan and India revealed advanced urban planning, intricate drainage systems, and a thriving culture that existed thousands of years ago. Their cities had standardized bricks, public baths, and organized streets long before some other civilizations had even emerged. Yet, for generations, this civilization was barely mentioned, and to this day, its language remains undeciphered, leaving us with more questions than answers. By uncovering these facts, we realize that the idea of civilization was never confined to one region. It was a shared human achievement that blossomed across the world. Another example lies in the stories of women throughout history whose voices were silenced. In revealing the untold, we uncover figures like Wu Zetian, the only female emperor in Chinese history, who ruled with intelligence and political skill during the Tang dynasty, or like Fatima al-Fadri, who in the 9th century founded the world's oldest continuously operating university in Morocco long before Europe's most famous institutions opened their doors. Stories like these transform our understanding of leadership, innovation, and influence, showing us that progress was never the work of men alone, but of humanity as a whole. These stories don't just add diversity to history, they correct it, showing us a more balanced reflection of the past. Revealing the untold also means listening to the voices of people whose stories were passed down not in books, but in memory. Indigenous oral traditions often describe landscapes, migrations, and events that are now being confirmed by science and archaeology. For centuries, these stories were dismissed as folklore, but when geologists discovered evidence of massive floods or ancient volcanic eruptions, they found that oral histories had preserved those events for thousands of years. In this way, the untold becomes a bridge between myth and fact, revealing that human memory has always carried truth, even when it was ignored by official narratives. Then there are the stories hidden in plain sight. Think about the contributions of African American inventors during and after slavery in the United States. Names like Garrett Morgan, who developed the traffic signal and gas mask, or Madam C.J. Walker, one of the first self-made female millionaires in America, are rarely mentioned in traditional history lessons. Their innovations shaped daily life, yet their recognition was buried under the weight of systemic racism. To reveal these untold stories is to acknowledge not only their genius, but also the resilience it took to thrive in a world that tried to erase them. And it's not just individuals. Entire societies remain untold because they don't fit the neat timelines of progress we've been taught. The Great Library of Alexandria, for example, is often remembered only for its destruction, But what about the knowledge that was actually preserved elsewhere? Manuscripts stored in Timbuktu, hidden during times of invasion, reveal sophisticated writings on astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Ancient Polynesian navigators, using nothing but the stars, ocean, swells, and birds, charted vast distances across the Pacific long before modern instruments existed. These stories reshape what we think we know about intelligence and exploration, revealing that human ingenuity has always existed everywhere, not just in the centers of power we were taught to admire. Revealing the untold is also about challenging assumptions we didn't even know we had. For example, for years, the Viking world was portrayed as exclusively male warriors raiding distant lands. But new discoveries of burial sites revealed women buried with weapons and honored as warriors, suggesting that women may have played a far greater role in Viking society than previously believed. These findings force us to reconsider long-standing stereotypes, showing that our image of the past is often far too narrow. Every time an untold story comes to light, it has the power to reshape our present. It tells us that human history is not a straight line leading from primitive to advanced or from ignorance to knowledge, but a vast web of ideas, cultures, and discoveries, many of which have been lost, hidden, or deliberately forgotten. When we reveal these stories, we are not just correcting errors, we are expanding the horizon of what humanity has achieved. We are reminded that greatness has always been global, that wisdom has always come from many directions, and that progress was never the work of a chosen few, but the shared effort of countless voices across time. So, what does all of this tell us? That the history we've been taught is only a fraction of the truth. Forgotten civilizations, biased narratives, and untold stories all remind us that the past is not a simple record, but a carefully chosen story, and when parts of that story are erased, distorted, or silenced, we lose not only knowledge but also a deeper understanding of who we are. Revealing the hidden side of history is not just about curiosity, it's about reclaiming what was taken, about giving voice to those who were denied, and about seeing humanity as a whole rather than through the narrow lens of the powerful. It shows us that every culture, every people, and every voice has contributed to the world we live in today. The real power of history is not in memorizing dates or battles, it's in seeing patterns, learning lessons, and realizing that our present is built on layers of truths, both remembered and forgotten. By challenging the version we've been given, by questioning the gaps, and by digging deeper, we start to uncover the bigger picture. And that picture is richer, more diverse, and far more inspiring than any textbook could ever teach. Because history is not just about the past, it's about identity, it's about perspective, and it's about the choices we make today. The more we uncover the hidden, the more we realize that the story of humanity is not yet finished and that the next chapter is ours to write.